The howling Arctic wind carried more than just snow and ice. It carried the desperate cries of two children who were about to become a polar bear's next meal. Jack Mitchell pressed his face against the frost-covered window of the research station, watching a scene that would haunt him forever. Two small figures stumbled through the white expanse, their dark parkas barely visible against the endless tundra. Behind them, closing fast, was the largest polar bear he had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jack's hands trembled as he reached for his rifle. He was just a cowboy from Texas, hired to manage the sled dogs at this remote weather station in northern Alaska. He knew nothing about polar bears, nothing about surviving in temperatures that could freeze a man solid in minutes. But he knew something about protecting the innocent, and those children were running out of time. The bear was massive, easily 12 feet tall when it reared on its hind legs. Its yellowed teeth gleamed in the pale Arctic sun as it roared, a challenge that echoed across the frozen landscape. The children stumbled and fell, their small bodies disappearing into a snowdrift. They were no more than 8 or 9 years old, Jack realized with growing horror. Too young to die like this. Too young for their story to end in such a brutal way. Jack didn't think, he just acted. Grabbing his Winchester and throwing on his heaviest coat, he burst through the station door into the brutal cold. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and instantly numbing his exposed skin. But he kept running, his boots crunching through snow that reached his knees with every step. The polar bear had reached the children now. Jack could see them huddled together in the snow, their arms wrapped around each other as the massive predator circled them like a wolf stalking sheep. The bear's black nose twitched as it caught their scent, and Jack knew he had seconds before those powerful jaws would end 2 young lives. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked across the tundra like thunder, and the bear's head snapped up to locate this new threat. Jack had deliberately aimed high, not wanting to wound the animal and make it more dangerous. He needed to draw it away from the children, not start a fight he couldn't win. The strategy worked. The polar bear abandoned its prey and began moving toward Jack with the confident stride of an apex predator that had never met anything it couldn't kill. Jack fired another warning shot, this one closer to the bear's massive paws. Snow exploded where the bullet hit, and the bear paused, studying this strange new creature that dared to challenge it. Jack began backing toward the research station, hoping to lead the bear away from the children and toward the safety of the building. But polar bears were faster than they looked. The massive creature suddenly charged, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Jack turned and ran, his heart pounding as he heard the bear's heavy breathing getting closer behind him. He almost made it to the station. He was within 10 yards of the door when his boot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. Jack went down hard, his rifle spinning away across the frozen ground. He rolled over to see the polar bear looming above him, its black eyes reflecting the intelligence that was both beautiful and deadly. The bear's massive paw, armed with claws longer than Jack's fingers, rose into the air. That's when the children appeared. They came from nowhere, these 2 small figures in dark parkas, shouting in a language Jack didn't recognize. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 8, had positioned herself between Jack and the bear. Her brother, slightly older, was waving his arms and making sounds that seemed to have an effect on the massive predator. The polar bear paused, its head tilting as it listened to the children's voices. Then, to Jack's amazement, the bear slowly lowered its paw and took a step backward. The boy continued speaking, his young voice steady despite the obvious danger. The girl never moved from her protective position over Jack's prone form. For several minutes that felt like hours, the 3 humans and the polar bear remained frozen in this impossible tableau. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, The bear turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow like a ghost made of ice and fur. Jack lay in the snow, staring up at the two children who had just saved his life. The girl was looking down at him with dark eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. Her brother was scanning the horizon, watching for the bear's return. Both children appeared completely calm, as if facing down 1,200 pounds of polar bear was just another day in their lives. "Thank you," Jack managed to say, his voice hoarse from the cold and fear. "You saved my life." The girl smiled and spoke in accented English. "You saved us first, Cowboy man. My name is Anna. This is my brother, Peter." Jack struggled to his feet, his legs shaking from adrenaline and cold. "I'm Jack Mitchell. Are you two all right?" That bear was going to... He couldn't finish the sentence. "We are fine," Peter said, his English more hesitant than his sister's. "But you are not dressed for the ice. You will freeze if we do not get you warm." Jack looked down at himself and realized the boy was right. His jeans were already stiff with frost, and he had lost feeling in his fingers despite his gloves. The children, by contrast, seemed completely comfortable in the brutal cold. Their parkas were made from some kind of fur he didn't recognize, and their boots appeared to be crafted from sealskin. "The research station is right there," Jack said, pointing toward the building that now seemed impossibly far away. "We can get warm inside." Anna and Peter exchanged a look that Jack couldn't interpret. There was something in their expressions, a sadness or perhaps resignation, that made his chest tighten. "We cannot go to the white man's building," Anna said softly. "Our grandfather would be angry. We are not supposed to be here." "Your grandfather?" Jack asked, though he was beginning to understand. These children were indigenous, probably from one of the Yupik communities he had heard about, but never encountered. They were a long way from any village he knew of, which raised the question of what they were doing out here alone. "We were hunting," Peter explained, as if reading Jack's thoughts. "Following the seal holes. But the storm came fast, and we got turned around. Then the ice bear found us." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Anna reached into her parka and pulled out a small carved figurine. It was beautiful, depicting a polar bear in mid-stride, its details so intricate Jack could see individual claws and fur texture. "My grandfather made this for protection," she said. "Maybe it worked, bringing you to help us." Jack took the figurine, surprised by its weight and warmth. The carving seemed to pulse with life in his hands, and for a moment he could swear he felt the heartbeat of the bear it represented. He handed it back to Anna, who tucked it safely away. "Where is your village?" Jack asked. "I can take you home in the snowmobile." Again, the children exchanged that look. Peter spoke quietly to his sister in their native language, and Anna nodded gravely. "Our village is far," Anna said, "beyond the broken ice fields where the white men do not go. But we know the way. We have been walking for 2 days." 2 days. Jack's mind reeled at the thought of these children surviving in the Arctic wilderness for 2 days, navigating terrain that would kill most adults within hours. Yet here they stood, calm and confident, as if they were discussing a walk to the local store. "You can't walk all that way," Jack protested. "It's too dangerous. There might be more bears, or you could get caught in another storm." "The ice speaks to us," Peter said simply. "We know when the bears are near, when the weather will change. Our grandfather taught us to listen." Jack wanted to argue, but something in the boy's voice stopped him. There was a certainty there, a connection to this harsh landscape that Jack knew he could never understand. These children belonged to this place in a way that he, despite months of living at the research station, never would. "At least let me give you supplies," Jack said. "Food, warm clothes, whatever you need." Anna smiled, and for the first time since the bear encounter, she looked like the child she was, You are kind, Cowboy man. But we have what we need." She patted a small pack on her back that Jack hadn't noticed before. "And we have something for you." She reached into her pack and pulled out what looked like a piece of carved bone. It was inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the Arctic light, though Jack knew that was impossible. The bone was warm to the touch, just like the bear figurine had been. "This is whalebone," Anna explained. "Very old, very powerful. My grandfather says it will protect you from the ice spirits." Jack wanted to tell her that he didn't believe in ice spirits, that he was a practical man who dealt with practical problems. But after what he had just witnessed, after seeing 2 children stop a charging polar bear with nothing but their voices, he found his skepticism crumbling like ice in the spring thaw. "Why are you giving this to me?" he asked. "Because you have a good heart," Peter said. "And because the ice bear did not kill you when it could have. That means something. The spirits are watching you now." Jack pocketed the carved bone, feeling its warmth against his ribs. "Will I see you again?" "Perhaps," Anna said mysteriously. "The ice has many stories to tell. Yours is just beginning." The children began walking away, their small forms quickly becoming indistinct in the swirling snow. Jack called after them, but they didn't turn around. Within minutes, they had vanished completely, as if they had never been there at all. Jack stood alone in the Arctic wind, wondering if he had imagined the entire encounter. But the carved bone in his pocket was real, and his rifle still lay in the snow where he had dropped it. Most convincing of all, he could still see the massive paw prints where the polar bear had stood over him, each print larger than a dinner plate. He retrieved his rifle and trudged back to the research station, his mind spinning with questions. Who were those children? How had they stopped a polar bear with nothing but words? And why did he feel like his life had just taken a turn towards something he couldn't begin to understand? The research station felt alien when he stepped inside, too warm and artificial after his encounter with the raw power of the Arctic. His colleague, Dr. Sarah Chun, looked up from her weather instruments with concern. "Jack, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "Where have you been?" Jack tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded crazy even to his own ears. A polar bear attack, 2 mysterious children, voices that could command wild animals. It all sounded like the ravings of someone suffering from cabin fever. Dr. Chun listened patiently, but Jack could see the skepticism in her eyes. "There aren't any Yupik villages within 100 miles of here," she said gently. "And polar bears don't just walk away from potential prey. Maybe the cold affected your perception." Jack pulled the carved bone from his pocket and showed it to her. Dr. Chun examined it carefully, her scientific mind analyzing its construction and age. "This is genuine," she admitted, surprise evident in her voice. "Probably centuries old, judging by the carving style." "Where did you say you got this?" "The girl gave it to me, Anna." Dr. Chun frowned, clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence with her rational worldview. "Jack, there's something you should know. I've been monitoring the weather patterns, and there's been no storm activity in this region for the past week. The conditions have been perfectly clear." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. If there had been no storm, then why had the children said they were lost? And how had they appeared so suddenly in the empty landscape around the research station? That night, Jack lay in his bunk thinking about the day's events. The carved bone sat on the table beside his bed, seeming to glow with its own inner light. Every time he looked at it, he remembered Anna's words about the ice spirits watching him. He had come to Alaska to escape his problems back in Texas. His family's ranch had failed during the drought, and he had lost everything he had worked for his entire life. The job at the research station was supposed to be temporary, just a way to earn money and figure out his next move. But now he wondered if he had been brought here for a different purpose. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Dr. Chun burst into the common area where Jack was having coffee, her face pale with excitement. "Jack, you need to see this," she said, pulling up a satellite image on her computer. "I've been analyzing the GPS data from yesterday, and there's something impossible here." The satellite image showed the area around the research station in perfect detail. Jack could see the building, the dog kennels, even the path he had taken when he ran toward the children. But there were no footprints other than his own. No sign of the children, no evidence of the polar bear. "That's impossible," Jack said. "I saw them. I touched them. They gave me this." He held up the carved bone. Dr. Chun shook her head. "I'm not saying you didn't see something, Jack. I'm saying that whatever you saw doesn't show up on satellite imagery. And that's not the strangest part." She pulled up another image, this one showing thermal signatures. "Look at this. There's a heat signature moving away from the station yesterday, but it's not human-shaped. It's too large, too diffuse, almost like a polar bear," Jack finished. "But polar bears are solitary animals," Dr. Chun said. "They don't travel with human children. And they certainly don't respond to voice commands." Jack stared at the thermal image, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The heat signature was definitely moving in the direction the children had taken when they left. But it was far larger than two small humans should generate. Over the following days, Jack found himself changed by the encounter. He became more attuned to the subtle rhythms of the Arctic, more aware of the way the wind spoke across the ice and the manner in which the aurora painted stories across the night sky. The carved bone never left his pocket, and sometimes he caught himself touching it when he needed comfort or guidance. The sled dogs, which had always been friendly but distant, began following him around like devoted pets. They seemed to sense something different about him, something that commanded their respect in a way his dog-handling skills never had. Even the lead dog, a massive husky named Kodiak, who had never shown affection to anyone, began sleeping outside Jack's door at night. Dr. Chun noticed the changes too. "You're different since that day," she observed one evening as they watched the northern lights dance overhead. "More focused, more connected to this place. It's like you belong here now." Jack couldn't argue with her assessment. Texas felt like a distant memory, a life that had belonged to someone else. The Arctic was becoming home in a way that surprised and frightened him. He found himself dreaming of ice and snow, of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. 3 weeks after the encounter with the children, Jack was checking the dog teams when he noticed unusual tracks in the snow. They were human footprints, but far larger than anything the research team could have made. The stride length suggested someone nearly 7 feet tall, and the prints pressed deep into the packed snow as if the walker carried enormous weight. Jack followed the tracks away from the station, his heart racing with anticipation and fear. The trail led toward the broken ice fields that Anna had mentioned, terrain so dangerous that even the most experienced Arctic explorers avoided it. But Jack felt drawn forward by a compulsion he couldn't resist. The tracks led to a place where the ice had formed into natural sculptures, twisted spires and arches that looked like the work of some ancient artist. In the center of this ice garden stood a man unlike anyone Jack had ever seen. He was indeed nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a linebacker and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. His parka was made from polar bear fur, and his face was weathered by decades of Arctic wind. But it was his eyes that captured Jack's attention, dark and ancient and filled with a wisdom that seemed to encompass the entire frozen world. "You are the cowboy who saved my grandchildren," the man said in perfect English, his voice carrying the weight of glaciers. Jack felt his knees go weak. "You're their grandfather." "I am Thomas Kanguk, chief of the Bear Clan, keeper of the old ways." The man studied Jack with those penetrating eyes. "Anna and Peter told me what you did, How you faced the great white bear to protect children who were not your own. Anyone would have done the same thing, Jack said, though he wasn't sure that was true. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. No, cowboy. Most men would have stayed behind their warm walls and told themselves it was not their concern. You chose differently. You chose as the bear spirits would choose. Jack pulled the carved bone from his pocket. Anna gave me this. She said it would protect me from ice spirits. Thomas examined the bone with reverence. This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It has not been given to an outsider in 200 years. Anna was wise to trust you with it. I don't understand any of this, Jack admitted. The children, the bear, these feelings I've been having. It's like I'm becoming someone else. You are not becoming someone else, Thomas said gently. You are becoming who you were always meant to be. The ice calls to certain souls, draws them away from the warm lands to serve a greater purpose. My people have legends of such men, warriors who come from far places to stand with us against the darkness. Thomas began walking deeper into the ice garden, and Jack followed without hesitation. The chief's presence was magnetic, commanding respect and attention in the same way the carved bone had commanded warmth and comfort. My grandchildren were not lost when you found them, Thomas continued. They were sent to find you, guided by visions that have been coming to our shamans for months. The spirit spoke of a man from the cattle lands, a man who would face the great bear without fear and earn the right to walk with our people. Jack felt the world shifting around him, reality rearranging itself into patterns he had never imagined. Possible. Sent to find me? But why? Thomas stopped beside a formation that looked like a throne carved from blue ice. Because the bears are changing, cowboy. The ice is breaking apart, and ancient things are stirring beneath the frozen ground. My people need allies who can stand between the old world and the new. Men who understand both the ways of the spirits and the ways of the outside world. I'm just a failed rancher, Jack protested. I don't know anything about spirits or ancient things. The bear could have killed you easily, Thomas replied, but it chose not to. That choice was not random, cowboy. The great white bear is the most sacred of all animals to my people, and it recognized something in you that even you do not yet see. Thomas reached into his parka and withdrew an object that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. It was a knife, but unlike any blade he had ever seen. The handle was carved from what looked like fossilized ivory, inscribed with symbols that seemed to move and flow like living things. The blade itself appeared to be made from some kind of metal that gleamed with an inner light. This is the bear claw, Thomas said, offering the knife to Jack. It has been carried by the champions of my people for 1,000 years. The blade is forged from metal that fell from the sky, and the handle is carved from the tusk of the first whale my ancestors ever hunted. Jack hesitated to take the weapon. I'm not one of your people. I don't have the right to carry something so sacred. The right is not given by blood or birth, Thomas said firmly. It is earned through actions and choices. You chose to face the bear for children you did not know. You chose to accept gifts from spirits you did not understand. Now you must choose whether to accept the responsibility that comes with those choices. Jack took the knife, feeling its weight and balance. The blade seemed to vibrate with power, and the carved symbols on the handle grew warm beneath his fingers. The moment he gripped the weapon fully, images flashed through his mind, visions of ice and snow and great bears moving through landscapes of impossible beauty. What am I supposed to do with this? Jack asked. Learn, Thomas said simply. My people will teach you the ways of the ice, the language of the bears, the secrets that have kept us alive in this harsh land for thousands of years. In return, you will help us face the challenges that are coming, the threats that require both ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Jack thought about his life back in Texas, the failed ranch and the debts he had left behind. None of that seemed important anymore, not compared to the sense of purpose that was filling his chest like warm light. What about the research station? My job? Thomas smiled again. Dr. Chun is a good woman, but her work here is nearly finished. The station will close next month, and she will return to her university. But you, Cowboy, you have found your true calling. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the ice garden. Jack turned to see Anna and Peter walking toward them, no longer dressed in their parkas, but in traditional clothing that seemed to be made from the hide of some Arctic animal he couldn't identify. "Grandfather," Anna said, bowing respectfully to Thomas. "The council is ready." "Council?" Jack asked. "The elders of all the bear clans," Peter explained. "They have come to see the man who faced the great white bear and lived. They want to hear your story from your own lips." Jack felt a surge of nervousness. I wouldn't know what to say. "Tell them the truth," Thomas advised. "Tell them about the choice you made when you saw my grandchildren in danger. Tell them about the moment you decided that their lives were worth more than your own safety. That is all they need to hear." The three Yupik led Jack deeper into the ice garden, through passages and chambers that seemed to have been carved by wind and time into something approaching a natural cathedral. The ice here was so clear that Jack could see deep into its crystalline structure, and he imagined he glimpsed shapes moving within the frozen depths. They emerged into a circular chamber where a dozen figures sat waiting on benches carved from ice. The elders were all elderly, their faces marked by decades of Arctic living, but their eyes held the same ancient wisdom that Jack had seen in Thomas's gaze. Men and women alike wore traditional clothing, decorated with beadwork and carved ornaments that depicted bears, whales, and other Arctic animals. At the center of the circle sat the most imposing figure Jack had ever encountered. She was a woman of perhaps 70, with silver hair braided with what looked like polar bear claws, and a face that radiated authority and power. When she looked at Jack, he felt as if she could see directly into his soul. "I am Saiku," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "I speak for all the bear clans, and I have lived through 7 decades of change and challenge. Thomas tells me you are the one spoken of in our prophecies, the outsider who would come to stand with us in the time of great change." Jack felt every eye in the chamber focused on him. The weight of their collective attention was almost overwhelming, but the carved bone in his pocket pulsed with warmth, giving him strength and confidence. "I'm just a man who saw children in danger," Jack said honestly. "I couldn't stand by and watch them get hurt." Siku nodded slowly. Simple words, but truth often is simple. "Tell us, outsider, what did you feel when you faced the great white bear?" Jack thought carefully before answering. "Fear," he said, "but also purpose. Like I was supposed to be there in that moment. Like everything in my life had led me to that place in time." A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled elders. Siku's stern expression softened slightly. "The bear could have killed you easily," one of the male elders observed, "but it chose not to. What do you think that means?" "I think it means I have something left to do," Jack replied. "Something important that I haven't figured out yet." "The spirits speak through the great bears," another elder explained. "When a bear chooses to spare a life, it is because that life has value beyond what we can see. You have been marked by the spirits, outsider. The question is whether you will accept what that marking means." Seiku stood, her movements graceful despite her age. "Thomas has told you some of what is coming, but not all. The ice is changing faster than ever before. Ancient things that have slept beneath the frozen ground for thousands of years are beginning to stir. And there are men from the outside world who seek to exploit these changes for their own profit. Men who would destroy our way of life without a thought." "What kind of men?" Jack asked. "Corporation men," Thomas said with disgust. "They want to drill for oil beneath the sacred hunting grounds, to build roads and pipelines across the paths our ancestors have traveled for countless generations. They see only resources to be extracted, not a living land that must be protected. We have fought such men before, Siku continued. But never when the ice itself was changing, never when the old powers were awakening. We need allies who understand both worlds, the world of spirits and the world of machines. You have shown that you can face the greatest of our sacred animals without fear. The question is whether you can face the men who would destroy them. Jack felt the bare claw knife hanging at his side, its weight both reassuring and intimidating. What would you need me to do? Learn our ways, Siku said. Become one of us in all but blood. And when the time comes, stand with us against those who would poison the ice and silence the voices of the bears. How long would that take? Time moves differently on the ice, Anna said from beside her grandfather. You could spend a year with us and return to find only a day has passed in the outside world. Or you could spend a day and find that years have gone by. The spirits decide such things. Jack thought about Dr. Chun and the research station, about his old life in Texas and the new life that was being offered to him. There was no real choice to make. His heart had already decided. I accept, he said simply. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The elders began speaking in their native language, voices rising and falling in what sounded like a chant or song. Anna and Peter smiled with obvious joy, and even Thomas's stern features showed approval. Siku approached Jack and placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was warm despite the cold chamber, and Jack felt power flowing between them like electricity. From this moment forward, you are Nanook Turak, she said solemnly, walker with bears. You will learn our language, our customs, our sacred knowledge. You will hunt with our men and listen to the wisdom of our women. And when you are ready, you will face the great test that every ice hunter must pass. What test? Jack asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer. You must journey alone onto the ice, with nothing but the knife and your courage. And there you must meet the bear, Chief himself. Not as an enemy to be fought, but as a brother to be acknowledged. If he accepts you, you will become one of us in truth. If he does not, well, Siku did not finish the sentence, but Jack understood. The bear chief would either accept him or kill him. There would be no middle ground. When do I start? Jack asked. Thomas smiled broadly, the expression making him look decades younger. You have already started, Nanook Turak. The moment you chose to face the great white bear, your training began. Now we will simply teach you to understand what you have already learned. And so began the most extraordinary chapter of Jack Mitchell's life, though he would soon learn that Jack Mitchell was a name that belonged to his past. Nanook Turak, walker with bears, had work to do on the ice. The first lesson came at dawn, when the Arctic sun painted the ice fields in shades of gold and pink that Jack had never imagined possible. Thomas led him away from the ice cathedral, where the council had met, deeper into territory that seemed untouched by any human presence. The snow here was different, softer somehow, as if it had been blessed by ancient ceremonies that predated written history. Jack's breath created clouds of vapor in the frigid air, but Thomas moved through the landscape as if the cold was nothing more than a gentle breeze. The elder's feet found purchase on ice that looked treacherous to Jack's untrained eye, and his movements had a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the frozen world around them. Walking on ice is not about fighting the surface, Thomas explained as Jack struggled to maintain his balance on a particularly smooth section. It is about understanding what the ice wants to tell you. Listen with your feet. Feel with your whole body. The ice speaks to those who know how to hear. Jack concentrated on the sensation beneath his boots, trying to feel what Thomas meant. Gradually, he began to notice subtle differences in the ice's texture and temperature. Some areas felt solid and permanent, while others seemed to vibrate with an energy that suggested movement or change. When he stepped on these unstable sections, he could sense their weakness before his weight could exploit it. Better, Thomas observed as Jack navigated a field of broken ice chunks without falling. You are beginning to listen. The ice has been your teacher for weeks now. Even when you did not know it was teaching, they walked for hours through terrain that shifted from smooth, glacial surfaces to jagged pressure ridges where massive ice sheets had collided with the force of geological movements. Jack's muscles ached from the constant effort of maintaining balance and stability, but he found himself oddly energized by the challenge. Each successful step felt like a small victory, each moment of perfect balance like a glimpse into something larger than himself. Anna and Peter appeared as if from nowhere, materializing out of a landscape that had seemed empty moments before. They moved with the same effortless grace as their grandfather, their young bodies perfectly adapted to the demands of Arctic travel. In their hands they carried tools that Jack did not recognize, implements carved from bone and antler that looked both ancient and impossibly sophisticated. Time for the second lesson, Anna announced with a smile that made her look even younger than her 8 years. Grandfather says you must learn to read the signs before you can hunt with the spirits. Peter knelt beside a section of ice that looked identical to everything around it, at least to Jack's inexperienced eyes. But when the boy began pointing out details, Jack realized he was looking at a complex story written in frost and snow. See here, Peter said, indicating a barely visible depression in the snow. Seal, young one, maybe 2 days ago. And here, he moved a few feet away, the mother following behind. She was protecting the pup, staying between it and the water. Anna joined her brother, adding her own observations. Fox tracks here, but old ones. He came after the seals were gone, looking for scraps. And this, she pointed to marks that Jack would have dismissed as wind patterns. Polar bear, but not hunting. Just passing through, heading north toward the deep ice. Jack stared at the seemingly blank canvas of snow and ice, trying to see what the children saw so clearly. Gradually, with their patient guidance, he began to pick out individual marks and patterns. A slight discoloration here marked where an animal had rested. A barely perceptible ridge there showed where something had been dragged across the surface. Reading the ice is like reading a book, Thomas explained as they continued their lesson. Every mark tells part of a story. Every track connects to every other track. The spirits write their intentions in the snow, and those who can read their writing will never be lost or surprised. The children spent the rest of the morning teaching Jack to identify different types of animal signs. Caribou tracks that told stories of migration and survival. Wolf prints that revealed pack dynamics and hunting strategies. Bird markings that indicated weather changes and seasonal shifts. Each lesson built upon the previous one, creating a complex web of knowledge that connected every living thing in the Arctic ecosystem. By midday, Jack's head was spinning with information, but he found himself seeing the landscape with entirely new eyes. What had once appeared to be an empty wasteland now revealed itself as a bustling highway of animal activity. Stories were written everywhere in the ice, tales of survival and death, migration and adaptation, all playing out according to rhythms that had existed since the world was young. Enough for today, Thomas declared as the pale sun reached its highest point in the sky. Too much learning too fast makes the mind like broken ice, unable to support weight. We will make camp and you will practice what you have learned. The camp they established was unlike anything Jack had experienced during his months at the research station. Instead of fighting against the environment, the Yupik worked with it, using the natural properties of snow and ice to create shelters that were both warm and virtually invisible from any distance. Thomas showed Jack how to cut blocks of snow with precise angles, how to fit them together in a spiral pattern that created a dome strong enough to support a grown man's weight. The igloo is not just shelter, Thomas explained as they worked. It is a partnership with winter itself. The snow wants to protect us, but we must build in harmony with its nature. Fight the snow, and it will fight back. Work with it, and it becomes stronger than any building made by outside men. Inside the completed shelter, the temperature was easily 30 degrees warmer than the outside air, despite having no heat source, other than their own bodies. Jack marveled at the engineering principles involved, the way the curved walls and carefully designed ventilation holes created a perfect microenvironment for survival. Anna and Peter had built their own smaller shelter nearby, and Jack was amazed to see how quickly and efficiently they worked. Their movements had the unconscious precision that came from years of practice, and they seemed to communicate without words, each anticipating what the other needed before it was requested. "How long have they been living like this?" Jack asked Thomas as they settled into their sleeping furs for the night. "Since they could walk," Thomas replied. "Our children learn the ice the way outside children learn to read books. It is not a skill for them, it is simply the way the world works. They know the difference between safe ice and dangerous ice the way you know the difference between a friendly dog and a mad one." Jack thought about his own childhood in Texas, learning to ride horses and work cattle under the endless blue sky. The skills had seemed natural to him then, passed down through generations of ranchers who understood the rhythms of the land and the animals they tended. But those skills seemed primitive compared to the sophisticated knowledge these children possessed about their environment. "What happened to their parents?" Jack asked quietly. Thomas was silent for so long that Jack wondered if he had asked an inappropriate question. Finally the elder spoke, his voice heavy with old grief. "The ice took them," he said simply. 3 years ago, during the spring hunt. The warming has made the ice unpredictable, breaking apart in ways that our ancestors never had to face. My son and his wife fell through what should have been solid ground. The children saw it happen, but there was nothing they could do." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "How could you know?" Thomas replied. "But this is why you are here, Nanook Turak. The old ways are not enough anymore. The ice is changing faster than our traditions can adapt. We need people who understand both worlds, who can help us find new ways to survive in a world that no longer follows the old rules." Outside their shelter, the wind began to pick up, creating a low moaning sound that seemed to carry voices from some distant place. Jack found himself listening to the sound, trying to pick out individual words or meanings the way he was learning to read tracks in the snow. "The spirits are restless tonight," Anna's voice came from the neighboring shelter. "They are talking about the changes that are coming." "What kind of changes?" Jack called back. "Big ones," Peter replied. "The kind that decide whether our people survive or disappear, like smoke in the wind." Jack lay awake for hours that night, listening to the wind and thinking about the weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. He had come to Alaska as a failed rancher looking for temporary work. Now he was being asked to help an entire culture survive the collision between ancient traditions and modern realities. The next morning brought Jack's first real test. Thomas led him to a section of coast where the ice met the open ocean, a place where massive floes ground against each other with the sound of distant thunder. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, showcasing the raw power of forces that could crush a man without noticing. "Today you learn to hunt," Thomas announced, "but not animals. Today you hunt understanding." The elder pulled a harpoon from his pack, a weapon that looked deceptively simple, but clearly represented generations of refinement and improvement. The shaft was made from what Jack guessed was walrus ivory, carved with symbols that seemed to flow like water. The point was metal, but unlike any alloy Jack had ever seen, with a blue-green tinge that suggested it might have come from the same source as the bear claw knife. "This harpoon has taken more than 100 seals," Thomas said with pride. "My grandfather made it, and his grandfather before him shaped the metal from skystone that fell into the ocean. The spirits have blessed this weapon with success, but only for those who understand its true purpose. What is its true purpose? Jack asked. To take only what is needed, and to give thanks for what is taken. The seals are our brothers, not our prey. They choose to give their lives so that we may live, and we must honor that choice with respect and gratitude. Thomas began demonstrating the proper stance and motion for using the harpoon. The technique was far more complex than Jack had anticipated, requiring precise timing, perfect balance, and an understanding of how moving ice affected both hunter and target. The elder's movements were fluid and graceful, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next. The seal will surface at that hole, Thomas said, pointing to what looked like solid ice to Jack's untrained eye. How do I know this? Because I have been watching the current, feeling the rhythm of the ocean beneath the ice. The seal knows this rhythm better than we do, and he will use it to find the easiest breathing spot. Jack stared at the apparently solid surface, trying to see what Thomas saw. Gradually, he began to notice subtle differences in the ice's color and texture that might indicate weakness or movement. The spot Thomas had indicated did seem slightly different from the surrounding area, though Jack couldn't have explained exactly how. They waited in silence for what felt like hours. Jack's muscles grew stiff from holding the unfamiliar position, and his feet went numb despite the warm boots Anna had given him. But Thomas remained perfectly still, his attention focused on the breathing hole with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse. When the seal finally surfaced, Jack almost missed it entirely. The animal appeared for perhaps 2 seconds, just long enough to take a breath, before disappearing back beneath the ice. But Thomas was ready. His harpoon flew through the air with deadly accuracy, striking the water exactly where the seal had been. Did you get it? Jack asked excitedly. Thomas smiled and began pulling on the harpoon line. The seal chose to give himself to us today. Now, we must honor his gift properly. The seal that emerged from the water was larger than Jack had expected, easily weighing 200 pounds. Its dark eyes still held a spark of life, and Jack felt an unexpected surge of sadness at its death. But Thomas immediately began speaking in his native language, words that sounded like a prayer or ceremony. I am thanking the seal's spirit, Thomas explained to Jack, asking forgiveness for taking his life, and promising that his sacrifice will feed not just our bodies, but our souls. The seal understands this. He chose to come to this breathing hole because he sensed we needed him. Anna and Peter appeared as if summoned by some signal Jack had not noticed. They helped Thomas pull the seal completely out of the water, working with practiced efficiency to prepare it for transport back to their village. Every part of the process seemed ritualized, from the way they handled the body to the specific cuts they made in the hide. Nothing is wasted, Anna explained as she worked. The meat feeds us, the fat gives us light and warmth, the hide becomes clothing and shelter, even the bones become tools and weapons. The seal gives us everything we need to survive. What about sport hunting? Jack asked, thinking of the deer hunting he had done back in Texas. Hunting just for the challenge or the trophy. The 3 Yupik exchanged looks that Jack could not interpret, but he sensed disapproval in their silence. Taking life for sport is an insult to the spirits, Thomas said finally. The animals give themselves to us because we need them to live. To kill for pleasure or pride is to break the agreement that has kept both hunters and prey in balance for thousands of years. Jack thought about the deer heads mounted on the walls of his father's ranch house, trophies from hunting trips that had been more about male bonding than survival. The memory made him uncomfortable in a way it never had before. The journey back to the village took most of the day, with Jack helping to pull the sled that carried their prize. The work was exhausting, but he found himself oddly satisfied by the physical effort. This was productive labor, work that directly contributed to the survival and well-being of the community. It felt different from the abstract financial dealings that had consumed so much of his energy back in Texas. The village itself was unlike anything Jack had expected. Instead of the primitive collection of huts he had imagined, he found a sophisticated community of perhaps 200 people living in structures that were perfectly adapted to their environment. The buildings were partially underground, insulated, with materials that included both traditional elements like animal hides and modern innovations like salvaged insulation from shipwrecks. The people who came out to greet them represented every age from infants to elders, who looked to be approaching 100 years old. Their faces showed the weathering that came from decades of Arctic living, but their eyes held warmth and intelligence that immediately made Jack feel welcome. Children ran alongside the sled, chattering excitedly in their native language while adults nodded approval at the successful hunt. The whole village benefits when any hunter succeeds, Thomas explained as people began helping to unload the seal. What one family catches is shared with all families. This is not generosity, it is simple survival. Today I bring food to the village. Tomorrow someone else will bring food to me. Jack watched as the seal was efficiently divided among dozens of families, each taking what they needed while leaving enough for others. There was no arguing or competition, no attempt by anyone to claim a larger share than their neighbors. The distribution seemed to follow rules that everyone understood, but no one needed to discuss. An elderly woman approached Jack with obvious curiosity. Her hair was completely white, and her face was lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades of smiling, but her movements were still vigorous and purposeful. She spoke to Thomas in their native language, gesturing toward Jack with interest. Atuat wants to meet the outsider who faced the Great Bear, Thomas translated. She is our eldest grandmother, keeper of the old stories, and the one who decides which traditions should be preserved and which should change. Atuat studied Jack with eyes that seemed to see far more than his physical appearance. She reached out and touched the carved bone in his pocket, nodding with satisfaction when she felt its warmth. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. She says the spirits have marked you for great things, Thomas translated. But she also says you carry sadness from your old life that must be released before you can fully embrace your new path. Jack felt exposed under the old woman's gaze, as if she could see the failures and disappointments that had driven him from Texas, the failed ranch, the mounting debts, the sense of being a disappointment to a family that had successfully worked the same land for 4 generations. How does she know about my old life? Jack asked. Thomas smiled. Atuat has been reading people's hearts for 80 years. She can see the weight you carry, the shame that sits on your shoulders like a heavy pack. She says this weight will make you weak when you need to be strong. Atuat spoke again, this time placing her weathered hand on Jack's chest. The touch was gentle but firm, and Jack felt warmth spreading through his entire body. The sensation was similar to what he experienced when holding the carved bone, but much stronger. She's offering to help you release the old pain, Thomas explained. But the choice must be yours. The ceremony she proposes will require you to face your failures honestly, to understand how they brought you to this place and this purpose. Jack thought about the weight of shame he had been carrying, the sense of being a failure that had followed him from Texas to Alaska. The prospect of laying down that burden was both appealing and terrifying. What would he be without the guilt and self-doubt that had defined him for so long? What kind of ceremony? He asked. Thomas conferred with Atuat in their native language before answering. The smoke lodge, he said finally. A place where truth burns. A way lies where the past can be released so the future can begin. But you must understand, Menuk Turek, that some ceremonies change you permanently. Once you enter the smoke lodge, you cannot return to being the man you were before. Jack looked around at the village, at the people who had accepted him based on a single act of courage, at the children who had already given him more trust than he felt he deserved. Anna and Peter were watching him with obvious concern, their young faces reflecting the importance of the choice he was being asked to make. When would this ceremony take place? He asked. Jack asked. "Tonight," Thomas replied. "During the dark time, when the spirits walk closest to our world. Atuat says the conditions are perfect for the kind of deep healing you need." Jack felt fear and anticipation warring in his chest. The rational part of his mind told him this was superstitious nonsense, primitive psychology dressed up in spiritual language. But another part of him, a part that was growing stronger every day he spent on the ice, recognized the truth in what Atuat was offering. "I accept," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Atuat smiled and patted his cheek with obvious approval. She spoke to Thomas again, her tone suggesting she was giving detailed instructions. "She says to eat lightly tonight, and to spend the remaining daylight hours in meditation," Thomas translated. "Think about your old life, all of it, both the good and the bad. When the ceremony begins, you must be ready to let it all go." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jack found himself walking through the village, observing the daily routines of people who had found a way to thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Children played games that taught them essential survival skills. Adults worked on crafts and tools that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Elders told stories that preserved history and wisdom for future generations. Everything he saw reinforced the same message. This was a community that valued cooperation over competition, sustainability over profit, spiritual connection over material accumulation. It was everything his own culture claimed to value but rarely practiced. And Jack found himself wondering what the world might look like if these principles guided all human societies. As darkness began to fall, Thomas came to collect him for the ceremony. The smoke lodge was located at the edge of the village, a low structure that seemed to grow organically out of the frozen ground. Smoke was already rising from a hole in the roof, carrying with it scents that Jack didn't recognize, but somehow found comforting. "Remember," Thomas said as they approached the lodge, "this ceremony is about truth. The smoke will show you things about yourself that you may not want to see, but you must face them without flinching. Only by accepting who you have been can you become who you are meant to be." Jack nodded, feeling his heart rate increase with each step toward the lodge entrance. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether he truly belonged with these people, or whether he was still just an outsider playing at being someone he wasn't. The time for pretending was over. Tonight, he would discover who Nanokturok really was. The interior of the smoke lodge was smaller than Jack had expected, forcing him to crouch as he entered behind Thomas. The space could hold perhaps 6 people sitting cross-legged on fur mats arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. The walls were lined with stones that had been heated until they glowed like embers, and the air was thick with aromatic smoke that seemed to penetrate every fiber of his being. Atuat was already seated beside the fire, her ancient hands moving rhythmically as she fed specific herbs and roots into the flames. Each addition changed the color and scent of the smoke, creating layers of fragrance that reminded Jack of everything, from pine forests to ocean spray. Other elders sat around the circle, their faces illuminated by the dancing firelight, their eyes closed in what appeared to be deep meditation. "Sit here," Thomas whispered, indicating a mat directly across from Atuat. "Face the fire, but do not stare into it. Let your eyes grow soft, let your mind become like still water." Jack settled onto the fur mat, immediately feeling the heat from the stones penetrating through his clothing. The temperature inside the lodge was almost unbearable, causing sweat to pour down his face and soak through his shirt. But the elders seemed completely comfortable, their breathing slow and steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. Atuat began to chant in a language that sounded even older than the Yupik words Jack had been learning. Her voice rose and fell in patterns that seemed to match the rhythm of the flickering flames, creating a hypnotic sound that made Jack's eyelids grow heavy. The smoke grew thicker, swirling around the lodge in currents that defied the normal laws of air movement. "Breathe deeply," Thomas instructed softly. "Let the sacred smoke carry away your resistance, your fear, your attachment to who you think you are." Jack inhaled the aromatic vapor, feeling it fill his lungs with warmth that spread throughout his body. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as if the smoke was alive and intelligent, seeking out every corner of his being that held tension or pain. His muscles began to relax despite the cramped position, and his mind started to drift into a state that was neither sleeping nor fully awake. Images began to form in the swirling smoke, memories from his childhood in Texas rising unbidden to the surface of his consciousness. He saw himself as a boy of 7, watching his father work with a difficult horse, learning the patience and persistence that would later serve him in ranching. The memory was vivid and immediate, as if he were experiencing it for the first time, rather than recalling something from decades past. "Do not judge what you see." Tachuate's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she sat only a few feet from him. "Simply observe as you would watch clouds pass across the sky." More memories surfaced, some pleasant and others painful. Jack watched himself graduate from high school, start working the family ranch, marry his childhood sweetheart Sarah in a ceremony that had filled the local church with friends and neighbors. Those had been good years when the future seemed bright and the ranch prospered under his father's experienced guidance. But then the drought came, 3 years of failed rains that turned their green pastures into dust bowls. Jack saw himself standing in barren fields, staring at cattle that grew thinner each day, making the impossible choice between selling at a loss or watching his animals starve. The bank meetings followed, conversations with men in suits who spoke in numbers and percentages while his family's legacy crumbled around him. "The pain you carry is not from the failure itself," Thomas's voice drifted through the smoke. "It is from believing you should have been able to control things beyond any man's control." Jack felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his marriage dissolve under the pressure of financial ruin. Sarah had tried to be supportive, but the constant stress and uncertainty had poisoned their relationship. The day she packed her bags and moved back to her parents' house remained one of the most devastating moments of his life. "I should have fought harder," Jack whispered, the words emerging without conscious thought. "I should have found a way to save everything." "Should have," Atuat repeated, her voice carrying gentle mockery. The words of a man who believes he is responsible for the rain and the drought, for the choices other people make, for the forces that shape the world. The smoke seemed to thicken around Jack, forming shapes that were half memory and half vision. He saw himself in those final months in Texas, drinking too much and isolating himself from friends who tried to help. Pride had kept him from accepting charity, and shame had kept him from admitting how lost he felt without the identity that had defined him since childhood. "The cowboy who cannot save his ranch is still a cowboy," one of the other elders spoke. "For the first time. But the man who believes his worth depends on his possessions has forgotten what it means to be human." Jack saw the moment when he had made the decision to leave Texas, abandoning everything he had known to take a temporary job in Alaska. He had told himself it was a practical choice, a way to earn money and figure out his next move. But now, in the clarity brought by the sacred smoke, he could see the deeper truth. He had been running from the shame of failure, fleeing to a place where no one knew his history or his disappointments. "Running brought you here," Atuat observed, as if reading his thoughts. "Running brought you to the moment when you chose to face the great bear for children you did not know. Sometimes we must lose our way completely before we can find our true path." The images in the smoke began to shift, showing him scenes from his time in Alaska. Jack watched himself learning to work with the sled dogs, gradually earning their respect through patience and consistency rather than dominance and force. He saw the moment when he first spotted Anna and Peter in danger, the instant when something deeper than conscious thought had compelled him to act. That moment, Thomas said softly, was when Jack Mitchell began to die and Nanook Turak began to be born. The heat in the lodge seemed to intensify, and Jack felt as if his skin was burning away, revealing something new and raw underneath. The pain was almost unbearable, but he sensed that fighting it would only make it worse. Instead, he tried to surrender to the process, to let the sacred smoke burn away everything that no longer served him. New visions formed in the swirling vapor, showing him possible futures that branched out like the tributaries of a great river. In some, he saw himself returning to Texas, trying to rebuild his old life with the bitter wisdom that came from failure. In others, he remained in Alaska, but never truly belonged, always an outsider looking in on a culture he could never fully understand. But there was another path, one that glowed with a different kind of light. Jack saw himself moving across the ice with the same confidence that Thomas displayed, reading the signs written in snow and wind with eyes that had been trained by generations of accumulated wisdom. He saw himself standing before the Great Bear Chief, not as a supplicant or an enemy, but as an equal who had earned the right to walk in both worlds. "This future is possible," Atuat said, her voice seeming to come from inside his own mind. "But it requires you to release everything you were before, to let that man die completely so that the new man can be born." Jack felt terror at the prospect of such complete transformation. Who would he be without his history, his memories, his sense of identity rooted in the Texas soil? But then he remembered the weight of shame he had been carrying, the constant feeling of being a failure who had disappointed everyone who ever believed in him. "I'm ready," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he spoke aloud or only thought the words. The smoke seemed to explode around him, filling his vision with swirling colors that had no names. Jack felt his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his physical body, drifting through space and time in ways that should have been impossible. He found himself floating above the Arctic landscape, seeing it as the spirits must see it, a living entity with its own consciousness and purpose. Far below, he could see the network of life that connected every creature on the ice. Seals and polar bears, Arctic foxes and caribou, all moving in patterns that created a vast, complex dance of survival and death, predator and prey. The humans were part of this dance, but only a small part, their role defined, not by dominance, but by their ability to live in harmony with forces far greater than themselves. "This is what you must learn to see," a voice said, though Jack couldn't tell which of the elders was speaking. "The web that connects all life, the balance that must be maintained if any are to survive." Jack felt himself descending back into his physical body, but he was changed by what he had experienced. The shame and regret that had defined him for so long seemed to have burned away, leaving behind something cleaner and stronger. He was still Jack Mitchell in his memories, but that identity no longer felt like a burden or a limitation. It was simply part of the journey that had brought him to this moment. When his vision cleared, he found himself looking into Atuat's ancient eyes. The old woman was smiling with an expression of profound satisfaction, as if she had just witnessed the successful completion of a task that had taken years to accomplish. "Welcome, Nanook Turak," she said in English, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The man who entered this lodge no longer exists. You have been reborn as one who walks with bears." Jack tried to speak but found his throat dry and raw from breathing the sacred smoke for what felt like hours. One of the elders offered him a cup of water that tasted of melted snow and wild herbs. The liquid was so cold it made his teeth ache, but it cleared his head and restored his voice. "How long was I?" he began, then realized he didn't know what question to ask. "Time moves differently in the smoke lodge," Thomas explained. "The sun has set and risen twice since we began, but for you, it may have felt like moments or years." Jack looked around the lodge, noticing details he had missed before. The stones that lined the walls were carved with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering firelight. The furs beneath him were softer than anything he had ever touched, and he could feel the life force of the animals they had come from, their spirits somehow still present in the material that had once been their skin. "What happens now?" Jack asked. "Now you learn what it truly means to be one of us," Ottawat replied. "The ceremony has prepared your spirit, but your body and mind must still be trained. You will live with us for one full cycle of seasons, learning our language and our customs, our hunting techniques, and our spiritual practices. When that time is complete, you will face the great test." "The Bear Chief," Jack said, remembering Thomas's earlier explanation. "The Bear Chief," Ottawat confirmed. "He who leads all the great white bears, he who decides which humans are worthy to hunt in the sacred places. If he accepts you, you will become a true ice hunter, guardian of the balance between our world and the spirit world. If he does not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jack understood. The Bear Chief would either accept him as a brother or kill him as an intruder. There would be no middle ground, no second chances. "How will I know when I'm ready?" Jack asked. "You will know," Thomas said simply. "The spirits will tell you when the time has come. But first, you must learn to live as we live, to think as we think, to see the world through eyes that have been opened to truths the outside world has forgotten." Over the following weeks, Jack threw himself into learning with an intensity that surprised even his teachers. The transformation in the smoke lodge had left him feeling lighter and more focused than he had been in years. The constant mental chatter of regret and self-doubt that had plagued him since leaving Texas was gone, replaced by a clarity of purpose that made every lesson feel essential and meaningful. Anna and Peter became his primary teachers, their youth, making them ideal instructors for someone who was essentially starting over in a new culture. They taught him the Yupik language through games and songs, showing him how each word carried layers of meaning that reflected the complex relationship between humans and their environment. "In our language," Anna explained one day as they worked on ice fishing techniques, "there is no word for owning land or animals. We have words for using, for caring for being responsible to, but not for possessing. This is because we understand that we belong to the land, not the other way around." Jack found this concept difficult to grasp at first, his mind still shaped by years of thinking about property and ownership in purely legal terms. But gradually, as he spent more time on the ice, he began to understand what Anna meant. The Arctic didn't care about human concepts of possession. It simply existed, vast and powerful, and utterly indifferent to the small creatures that struggled to survive on its surface. Peter taught him the practical skills of ice hunting, showing him how to read the subtle signs that indicated where seals were likely to surface, how to move silently across terrain that could betray the slightest misstep with a sound that would alert every animal for miles. The boy's patience was remarkable, never showing frustration when Jack made mistakes or failed to understand concepts that seemed obvious to someone raised in this environment. "Hunting is not about taking," Peter explained as they waited motionless beside a breathing hole. "It is about being worthy to receive what the spirits choose to give. The seal will come when it senses that we are ready, when our hearts are pure and our intentions are honorable." The seal that eventually surfaced seemed to look directly into Jack's eyes before Peter's harpoon took its life. In that moment of connection, Jack felt something shift inside him, a recognition that hunting was indeed a sacred act, a communion between predator and prey that transcended simple survival. Thomas continued to serve as Jack's guide into the deeper mysteries of Yupik spirituality. The elder taught him to recognize the signs that indicated spiritual activity, the subtle changes in weather and animal behavior that suggested the presence of forces beyond the physical world. "The spirits are always speaking," Thomas explained, during one of their long walks across the tundra. "But most people have forgotten how to listen. They are too busy with the noise inside their own heads to hear the voices that could guide and protect them. Jack learned to identify different types of spiritual presence, from the benevolent guardians that watched over successful hunts to the darker entities that could lead travelers astray or drive them mad with visions of false safety. Each type of spirit required a different approach, a specific combination of respect, caution, and understanding. The physical conditioning was as intense as the spiritual training. Jack's body, already hardened by months of working with sled dogs in harsh conditions, was pushed to new limits by the demands of traditional Arctic living. He learned to function on minimal sleep during the summer months when darkness never came, and to conserve energy during the winter periods when the sun disappeared entirely. His diet changed dramatically, shifting from the processed foods he had grown accustomed to at the research station to the traditional Yupik combination of fresh meat, fish, and sea mammals supplemented by berries and roots gathered during the brief summer season. The change was difficult at first, but gradually he found himself feeling stronger and more energetic than he had in years. "The land provides everything we need," Atuat explained as she taught him to identify edible plants and mushrooms. But only to those who understand how to ask properly and how to take only what is needed. Most challenging of all was learning to navigate the complex social structure of the village. The Yupik had developed sophisticated systems for resolving conflicts, sharing resources, and making decisions that affected the entire community. Jack had to unlearn the individualistic mindset that had shaped his thinking in Texas and embrace a more collective approach to problem solving. In the outside world, success is measured by how much you can accumulate for yourself, Thomas observed during one of their evening conversations. Here, success is measured by how much you can give to others while still maintaining the strength to contribute. Jack watched this principle in action every day, seeing how the most respected members of the community were those who consistently put the needs of others before their own. Hunters shared their catches without being asked. Craftspeople gave away their finest work to those who needed it most. And elders devoted their time to teaching young people skills that would benefit the entire tribe for generations to come. As the months passed, Jack found himself changing in ways that went far beyond language and hunting techniques. His relationship with the natural world deepened until he could sense weather changes hours before they arrived, could detect the presence of animals from subtle signs that would have been invisible to his former self. The carved bone that Anna had given him during their first encounter had become warm to the touch, pulsing with energy that seemed to grow stronger as his connection to the Arctic deepened. Thomas explained that this was a sign of spiritual development, evidence that Jack was becoming worthy of the gifts the spirits had chosen to bestow upon him. "The bone remembers every person who has carried it," Thomas said one evening as they sat around the fire. "It has been waiting for someone who could awaken its full power, someone who could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new world that is coming." Jack didn't fully understand what Thomas meant, but he could feel truth in the elders' words. Something was building toward a climax, a moment of testing that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the entire community. The skills he was learning, the spiritual connections he was developing, were all preparation for a challenge that remained undefined, but felt increasingly imminent. Winter was approaching, bringing with it the long darkness that would test every lesson he had learned. Somewhere in that darkness, the Bear Chief waited, the final arbiter of whether Jack Mitchell had truly died and Nanook Turek had truly been born. The signs came gradually at first, so subtle that Jack almost missed them entirely. It began with the sled dogs becoming restless at night, whining and pacing in their traces despite having been fed and exercised. Then the aurora borealis started, appearing in patterns that the elders described as unusual, spiraling formations that seemed to pulse with an intelligence of their own. Most telling of all, the polar bears began moving toward the village in numbers that defied their normally solitary nature. Thomas found Jack practicing his harpoon technique on the frozen shore, when the fourth bear sighting was reported. The elder's expression was grave as he approached, his weathered face reflecting concerns that went beyond normal wildlife management. "It is time," Thomas said simply, his words carrying the weight of inevitability. "The bear chief is calling. He has been watching your progress, and now he demands to meet the one who claims the right to walk with his people." Jack felt his stomach drop as the reality of what lay ahead finally crystallized. For months, the prospect of facing the bear chief had seemed like a distant challenge, something to prepare for but not yet confront. Now, with winter settling over the Arctic landscape like a living thing, that moment of ultimate testing had arrived. "How do you know?" Jack asked, though part of him already understood the answer. Thomas pointed toward the horizon where a massive shape was moving across the ice fields with deliberate purpose. Even at a distance of several miles, Jack could see that this was no ordinary polar bear. The creature was enormous, easily twice the size of the largest bear he had encountered during his training. More unsettling still was the way it moved, with a purposefulness that suggested intelligence far beyond animal instinct. "The Great One comes," Thomas said with reverence that bordered on awe. "Turngay, the bear who speaks with the voice of winter itself. He has ruled the ice for longer than our oldest stories remember, and he decides who is worthy to hunt in the sacred places." Jack watched the massive figure approaching across the frozen landscape, feeling a mixture of terror and anticipation that made his hands shake. Everything he had learned over the past months, every skill and spiritual insight, would be put to the ultimate test in the next few hours. "What am I supposed to do?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You will go to meet him," Thomas replied. "Alone, with nothing but the bear claw knife and the courage you have found within yourself. You cannot hunt him, you cannot flee from him, you cannot try to appease him with offerings. You must simply face him as an equal and let him judge whether you are worthy of the sacred trust." Anna and Peter appeared at Jack's side, their young faces solemn with the gravity of the moment. In their hands they carried items that Jack recognized as ceremonial regalia, clothing and ornaments that had been blessed by generations of spiritual leaders. "These belong to the last ice hunter," Anna explained as she helped Jack into a parka made from white bear fur. "He died 20 years ago defending our hunting grounds from oil prospectors. Since then, no one has been chosen to take his place." The parka was unlike anything Jack had ever worn, lighter than regular fur but somehow warmer, as if it retained the body heat of every person who had ever worn it. The bear claw knife felt heavier at his side, its ancient metal humming with power that seemed to resonate with his own heartbeat. Peter placed a necklace of carved whalebone around Jack's neck, each piece inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the Arctic light. "These will help the bear chief see your true spirit," the boy explained. "They cannot make you worthy, but they will ensure that he judges you fairly." A Tuat emerged from her dwelling as the village gathered to witness Jack's departure. The ancient shaman moved slowly but purposefully toward him, carrying something wrapped in sealskin that radiated warmth despite the frigid air. "This is the Heartstone," she said, unwrapping an object that looked like polished obsidian but felt warm as living flesh. "It has been carried by every ice hunter for 1,000 years. If you survive the encounter with Turngay, it will be yours to keep. If you do not—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jack understood. The Heartstone would be recovered from his frozen body and saved for the next candidate, whenever one might appear. The entire village had gathered to see him off, men and women and children forming a circle around him as he prepared to walk out onto the ice. Their faces showed a mixture of hope and concern that made Jack realize how much was riding on this encounter. He wasn't just facing a test of his own worthiness. He was potentially providing the community with its first ice hunter in 2 decades. "Remember," Thomas said as Jack prepared to leave, "Turngay is not your enemy, but he is not your friend either. He is a force of nature, ancient and powerful, and utterly without mercy for those who approach him with false hearts. Show him respect, but do not grovel. Demonstrate courage, but do not be reckless. Above all, be honest about who you are and what you seek." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. But beneath the pressure, he sensed something else, a calm certainty that whatever happened in the next few hours was meant to happen. His entire life, from his childhood in Texas to his failures as a rancher to his chance encounter with Anna and Peter, had been leading to this moment. He began walking across the frozen bay toward the distant figure of the bear chief, his boots crunching on snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the pale Arctic sun. Behind him, the village gradually faded into the distance until he was alone on the vast expanse of ice, with only the approaching predator for company. As the distance between them decreased, Jack began to appreciate the true magnitude of the creature he was approaching. Torngay stood at least 15 feet tall when reared on his hind legs, with shoulders broader than a doorway and paws that could crush a human skull without effort. His fur was not the yellowed white of ordinary polar bears, but pure silver that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But it was the bear's eyes that truly set him apart from any natural animal. They were ancient and intelligent, holding depths of knowledge that spoke of centuries of existence. When those eyes fixed on Jack, he felt as if every secret he had ever harbored was being examined and weighed. Jack stopped walking when he was still 50 yards from the great bear, instinctively understanding that approaching any closer without invitation would be seen as aggression. Torngay studied him for long minutes, his massive head tilting as he evaluated this strange human who dared to seek an audience. Then the bear spoke. The words came not as sound, but as thoughts that appeared directly in Jack's mind, carrying meanings that transcended any human language. The voice was ancient and powerful, like glaciers grinding against stone or wind howling across endless ice fields. "You are the one who saved the children," Torngay said, his mental voice carrying overtones of curiosity and evaluation. "The one who faced my brother without weapons, who earned the right to walk with the people of the ice." "I am," Jack replied, unsure whether he was speaking aloud or simply thinking his response. "I seek the honor of becoming an ice hunter, a guardian of the balance between your realm and the world of men." "Many have sought this honor," Torngay replied. "All have failed. What makes you different from those who came before?" Jack considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer might determine whether he lived or died in the next few moments. "I don't know if I am different," he said honestly. "I only know that I cannot be who I was before, and I cannot become who I need to be without your acceptance." The great bear moved closer, his massive paws leaving prints in the snow that were larger than dinner plates. Jack forced himself to remain still as Torngay circled him, examining him from every angle with those ancient, intelligent eyes. "You carry the scent of failure," the bear observed, "of dreams that died and hopes that withered. Why should I trust one who could not protect what was his?" The words cut deep, stirring up memories of the failed ranch and the marriage that couldn't survive the pressure of financial ruin. But Jack had learned in the smoke lodge to face his failures without shame, to see them as necessary steps in a journey that had brought him to exactly where he needed to be. "Because failure taught me that some things are more important than success," Jack replied. "It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. When I saw Anna and Peter in danger, I didn't think about success or failure. I only thought about what was right." Torngay paused in his circling, his great head lowering until his muzzle was only inches from Jack's face. The bear's breath was warm against his skin, carrying scents of ice and fish and something else, something wild and primal that spoke to parts of Jack's consciousness he hadn't known existed. "You speak of rightness," the bear said, "but right and wrong are human concepts. I know only balance and imbalance, harmony and discord. The ice is changing, and the old balances are shifting. Those who would be ice hunters in the time that is coming must understand both the ancient ways and the new realities. I'm willing to learn, Jack said. To serve as a bridge between worlds if that's what's needed. Willingness is not enough, Tundra replied, his mental voice carrying undertones of challenge. You must prove that you can stand between the forces that would destroy the ice and those who depend on it for survival. You must show that you can make the hard choices that leadership requires. The great bear stepped back and gestured with one massive paw towards something behind Jack. Turning, Jack saw a sight that made his blood freeze in his veins. A convoy of vehicles was approaching across the ice, massive trucks and drilling equipment that could only belong to an oil exploration company. They come to tear holes in the sacred ice, Tundra explained. To spill poison into the waters where my people hunt and the seals raise their young. The old ice hunter would have stopped them with force, but he is gone. The choice now falls to you. Jack counted at least 20 vehicles in the convoy, along with what looked like armed security personnel riding in the lead trucks. Even if he had been carrying a rifle instead of just the bare claw knife, he would have been hopelessly outnumbered. But he sensed that Tundra wasn't asking him to single-handedly stop an industrial operation through violence. What would you have me do? Jack asked. What an ice hunter does, the bear replied cryptically. Protect the balance. The convoy was close enough now that Jack could see individual faces through the windshields of the lead vehicles. The men looked confident and determined, clearly believing they had every right to exploit whatever resources they might find beneath the Arctic ice. They probably had legal permits and government approvals, documentation that would mean nothing to the polar bears and seals whose lives would be disrupted by their activities. Jack thought about everything he had learned during his months with the Yupik people, the deep understanding of interconnectedness that governed their relationship with the natural world. These oil workers weren't evil men, but they represented a worldview that saw the Arctic as a collection of resources to be extracted, rather than a living ecosystem to be preserved. Moving slowly and deliberately, Jack walked toward the approaching convoy until he stood directly in their path. The lead truck slowed and then stopped, its driver clearly unsure how to react to the sight of a lone figure blocking their way across the ice. A man in an expensive parka climbed out of the passenger seat, his face showing annoyance at the unexpected delay. He was clearly in charge of the operation, probably a senior engineer or project manager accustomed to having his orders followed without question. You need to move out of the way, the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who rarely had his decisions challenged. This is a legitimate exploration operation with all the proper permits. The ice doesn't recognize your permits, Jack replied, his own voice carrying new tones of authority that he hadn't possessed before. And neither do the people who depend on this place for survival. Look, friend, the man said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. I understand your concerns, but we're not here to cause any permanent damage. We're just conducting some test drilling to assess the potential reserves in this area. Test drilling that will drive away the seals and pollute the water where families have hunted for thousands of years. Jack countered. You might not intend permanent damage, but that's exactly what you'll cause. Behind him, Jack could sense Tundra watching the confrontation with intense interest. This was the test, he realized. Not a trial by combat or a demonstration of hunting skills, but a test of whether he could stand up to the forces that threatened the Arctic ecosystem without resorting to violence. More men had climbed out of the vehicles now, including several who carried themselves with the bearing of professional security personnel. They weren't threatening yet, but Jack could see them positioning themselves to intervene if the situation escalated. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, the project manager said, his patience clearly wearing thin. We have a schedule to keep in investors who are expecting results. "And I'm going to have to ask you to turn around and go back where you came from," Jack replied calmly. "This ice is protected by treaties that your government signed decades ago. Those treaties apply to permanent installations, not temporary exploration," the man argued. "We've done our legal homework, and we have every right to be here." Jack felt the bare claw knife humming at his side, its ancient metal responding to the spiritual energies that were building around the confrontation. But he sensed that drawing the weapon would be exactly the wrong move that Turngaye was testing. His ability to find solutions that didn't depend on force. "Rights," Jack said thoughtfully. "That's an interesting concept. Do you have the right to destroy something that can never be replaced? Do you have the right to drive an entire ecosystem toward collapse for the sake of short-term profits?" "We're not going to destroy anything," the project manager insisted, though his tone suggested he was beginning to doubt his own words. "Modern drilling techniques are much more environmentally friendly than they used to be. Tell that to the polar bears," Jack said, gesturing toward the horizon where several white shapes were now visible. "Tell that to the Yupik families who will starve if the seals disappear from these waters." The appearance of the polar bears had a visible effect on the oil workers, many of whom were clearly not accustomed to operating in areas where such predators were present. Jack could see them exchanging nervous glances and checking their weapons, suddenly aware that they were very far from the safety of civilization. "Look," the project manager said, his voice taking on a note of desperation. "I understand your position, but I have orders from corporate headquarters. If I don't come back with the geological data they're expecting, I'll lose my job. And if you do come back with that data, these people will lose their way of life," Jack replied. "Which do you think is more important?" The question hung in the air between them, crystallizing the fundamental conflict between two completely different ways of understanding value and progress. Jack could see the project manager struggling with the moral implications of what he had been asked to do, perhaps for the first time really considering the broader consequences of his actions. Behind the lead truck, some of the workers had begun talking among themselves in voices that carried across the still Arctic air. Jack caught fragments of their conversation, enough to understand that not everyone in the convoy was completely comfortable with their mission. "There are other places to drill," one of the workers was saying. "Lots of places that aren't sacred to the local people." "Corporate doesn't care about sacred," another replied. "They care about profits, and geological surveys that show this area has the highest probability of significant reserves." The project manager seemed to be listening to the same conversation, his expression growing more troubled with each exchange. Jack sensed that the man was fundamentally decent, probably someone who had taken the job because he needed the work rather than because he was passionate about oil exploration. "What if I told you there was a way to satisfy your corporate headquarters without destroying this particular area?" Jack asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "I'd say you don't understand how the oil business works," the manager replied, but there was hope in his voice. "I understand how the media works," Jack countered. "I understand how public relations campaigns work. And I understand that your company probably doesn't want to be seen as the outfit that destroyed a pristine Arctic ecosystem against the wishes of the indigenous people who depend on it." The project manager's eyes widened as he began to grasp the implications of what Jack was suggesting. "You're talking about turning this into a public relations nightmare." "I'm talking about giving your company the opportunity to be seen as environmentally responsible," Jack corrected. "To voluntarily withdraw from exploration in this area as part of a broader commitment to sustainable development." "That's not my decision to make," the manager protested. "No, but it's your recommendation to make," Jack replied. "You can go back and tell your superiors that the geological challenges in this area are more complex than anticipated, that the environmental risks are higher than acceptable, that the potential for negative publicity outweighs the potential profits." Jack could see the man weighing his options, calculating risks and benefits with the kind of analytical mind that had probably made him successful in his field. The oil company might not be happy about losing access to potential reserves. They would be even less happy about a public relations disaster that could affect their operations worldwide. "And if I refuse?" the manager asked. "Then you'll have to explain to your investors why your drilling operation was shut down by federal marshals responding to treaty violations," Jack said calmly. "Because that's my next phone call." It was a bluff, but a believable one. Jack had no way to contact federal authorities from his current location, but the project manager didn't know that. More importantly, the threat carried weight because it was based on legitimate legal principles that could indeed be enforced if the right people became involved. The manager looked around at his convoy, at the men who were depending on him for leadership, at the vast expanse of ice that suddenly seemed less like an exploitable resource and more like a living entity that demanded respect. Jack could see the moment when the man's perspective shifted, when he began to understand what was really at stake in their confrontation. "I'll need to make some calls," the manager said finally. "Take all the time you need," Jack replied. "But understand that every minute your equipment sits on this ice is another minute you're in violation of treaties that protect this area." The next hour passed with agonizing slowness as the project manager conducted a series of increasingly heated phone conversations with his corporate superiors. Jack remained standing in front of the convoy, acutely aware that Turngay was still watching from the distance, evaluating his performance in this crucial test. Finally, the manager approached him with an expression of resignation mixed with what might have been relief. "We're pulling out," he announced. "Corporate isn't happy about it, but they agree that the potential complications outweigh the potential benefits. We'll be recommending that this area be designated as environmentally sensitive and removed from future exploration plans." Jack felt a surge of triumph that was immediately tempered by understanding of how fragile this victory really was. The oil company might withdraw for now, but there would be other companies, other projects, other threats to the delicate balance that sustained life in the Arctic. "Thank you," Jack said simply. "You've made the right choice." "I hope so," the manager replied. "I've got a daughter about the age of those kids you mentioned. I'd hate to think I was destroying the world she's going to inherit." As the convoy began its slow process of turning around and departing, Jack walked back across the ice toward where Turngay waited. The great bear had remained motionless throughout the entire confrontation, but Jack could sense approval in his ancient gaze. "You chose wisdom over strength," Turngay observed as Jack approached. "Persuasion over force. These are the qualities that will be needed in the struggles that are coming." "Was that the test?" Jack asked. "Part of it," the bear replied. "The final test is whether you can bear the weight of the knowledge I am about to share with you." Turngay began walking toward the interior of the ice field, and Jack followed without hesitation. They traveled for what felt like hours across terrain that grew progressively more fantastic, with ice formations that looked like crystal palaces and snow sculptures that seemed to have been shaped by artistic hands. Eventually they reached a place that defied all logic and natural law. It was a valley carved into the ice, but a valley filled with warmth and growing things, as if summer had been preserved in a pocket of winter. Grass grew here, and flowers, and trees that should never have been able to survive in the Arctic climate. "This is the heart of the ice," Turngay explained. "The place where the old magic still runs strong, where the spirits maintain the balance that keeps the world from falling into chaos. Very few humans have ever seen this place, and fewer still have been granted the right to protect it." Jack stared in amazement at the impossible garden that surrounded them. He could feel power radiating from every plant and stone, an energy that seemed to connect this place to every other part of the Arctic ecosystem. "Why are you showing me this?" Jack asked. "Because you have proven yourself worthy to become its guardian," Turngay replied. The ice is changing, and the old ways of protection are no longer sufficient. The sacred places need defenders who understand both the ancient powers and the modern threats. The great bear gestured toward the center of the valley, where a pool of water reflected the aurora borealis despite the fact that it was daylight and the northern lights shouldn't have been visible. "Drink from the sacred pool," Turngay commanded. "Let its power join with your own and become what you were, always meant to be." Jack approached the pool with reverence, kneeling beside its edge and cupping the crystal-clear water in his hands. The liquid was warm despite the Arctic setting, and when he drank it, he felt power flowing through his body like electricity. Visions flashed through his mind, images of the Arctic as it had been thousands of years ago, as it was now, and as it might become. He saw the interconnected web of life that sustained everything from the smallest Arctic fox to the mightiest polar bear. He saw the threats that were approaching from the outside world, the forces of exploitation and destruction that would test his abilities to their limits. Most importantly, he saw his role in the struggle to come, not as a warrior or a hunter, but as a bridge between worlds, a translator who could help both sides understand what was truly at stake in the battle for the Arctic's future. When the visions faded, Jack found himself changed in ways that went far beyond the physical. He could sense the thoughts and emotions of every living thing in the area, could feel the subtle currents of power that flowed beneath the ice. The bear claw knife at his side now felt like an extension of his own body, and the carved bone amulets around his neck pulsed with warmth that spoke of acceptance and belonging. "Rise, Nanukturak," Turngay commanded. "Rise as the new ice hunter, guardian of the sacred places and defender of the balance." Jack stood, feeling the weight and honor of his new role settling around him like a cloak made of starlight. He was no longer the failed rancher who had fled Texas in shame, nor was he simply the outsider who had learned to survive in the Arctic. He was something new, something that had never existed before, a bridge between the world of spirits and the world of men, charged with protecting both from the forces that would destroy them. The journey back to the village passed in a blur of spiritual energy and heightened awareness. Jack found himself seeing the landscape with entirely new eyes, perceiving layers of meaning and connection that had been invisible before his transformation. Every snowflake told a story, every breath of wind carried messages from distant places. When they reached the village, the entire community was waiting for them. Jack could see in their faces that his success was immediately apparent, that something in his bearing or expression announced his transformation more clearly than any words could have done. Thomas stepped forward with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Welcome home, Ice Hunter," he said simply. "Welcome to the beginning of your real work." 1 year had passed since Jack's transformation into Nanukturak, and the Arctic had become a different place entirely. Word of the Ice Hunter's return had spread across the frozen territories like wildfire, reaching not only the scattered Yupik communities, but also the corporate boardrooms and government offices of the outside world. The man who had once failed as a Texas rancher had become something far more powerful, a symbol of resistance against forces that would exploit the Arctic without regard for consequences. The changes were visible everywhere Jack looked. The village, that had once struggled to maintain its traditional way of life, now thrived with renewed confidence. Young people who might have abandoned their heritage for opportunities in distant cities chose instead to remain and learn the ancient skills from elders who had feared their knowledge would die with them. The hunting grounds that had been threatened by industrial development were now protected by a combination of legal challenges and spiritual defenses that made corporate executives think twice before venturing onto the sacred ice. Jack stood on the shore where he had first encountered Anna and Peter, watching the sunrise paint the frozen landscape in shades of gold and pink that never failed to take his breath away. The bear claw knife at his side hummed with contentment, its ancient metal finally wielded by hands that understood its true purpose. The carved bone amulets around his neck pulsed with warmth that spoke of acceptance not just from the spirits, but from a community that had claimed him as their own. Anna and Peter approached across the ice, no longer the frightened children he had first rescued, but confident young hunters who had learned to read the wind and ice with skill that would have impressed their ancestors. At 12 and 13, respectively, they moved with the grace of adults who had been tested by the harsh realities of Arctic survival. "The council wants to see you," Anna announced, her English now fluent, but retaining the musical quality that marked her as a daughter of the ice. "There are visitors from the southern villages, and they bring news of new troubles." Jack nodded, having expected this moment for weeks. His success in turning back the oil exploration convoy had made him a target for forces that saw the Arctic as nothing more than a collection of resources to be extracted. But it had also made him a beacon of hope for indigenous communities across the circumpolar north who faced similar threats to their traditional territories. The council lodge had been expanded to accommodate representatives from a dozen different communities, men and women who had traveled hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain to seek the wisdom of the legendary ice hunter. Their faces bore the weathering that came from lifetimes spent in the world's harshest environments, but their eyes held the fierce intelligence of people who had never surrendered their connection to the land. Thomas gestured for Jack to take his place in the circle, a position of honor that still felt strange despite months of growing into his role as spiritual leader and protector. The elder's face showed pride in what his student had accomplished, but also concern for the challenges that lay ahead. "The mining companies have returned," announced a woman from the Northern Territories, her voice carrying the weight of generations who had fought to protect their homeland. "They bring new technology, new legal arguments, new promises that their operations will not disturb the traditional hunting grounds, and new threats for those who oppose them," added a man whose scarred hands spoke of battles fought and sometimes lost. 3 villages have already been forced to relocate when their water sources were contaminated by exploratory drilling. Jack listened to the reports with growing anger, feeling the bear spirit within him respond to the injustices being described. But his transformation in the sacred pool had taught him that rage without wisdom was merely destruction wearing a righteous mask. The true power of the ice hunter lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to protect. "What do the spirits counsel?" Jack asked, his voice carrying the authority that came from communion with forces older than human civilization. Otuat rose slowly from her place beside the fire, her ancient frame radiating power that made the air itself seem to shimmer. At 93, she remained the most respected shaman among all the Arctic peoples, and her words carried weight that transcended tribal boundaries. "The ice speaks of change," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite its obvious age. "Not the gradual change that our people have always adapted to, but transformation that comes like avalanche, swift and terrible, and reshaping everything in its path." She moved to the center of the circle, her movements fluid despite her years. In her hands she carried a bowl carved from walrus ivory, its surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to move and flow in the firelight. "The old barriers between worlds grow thin," Otuat continued. "The spirit realm and the material realm begin to overlap in ways that will bring both great power and great danger. Those who would exploit the sacred places will find their tools and weapons turned against them. But those who serve the balance will discover abilities beyond anything our ancestors dreamed possible." Jack felt the truth of her words resonating in his bones. Over the past year, his connection to the Arctic ecosystem had deepened until he could sense disturbances in the natural balance from hundreds of miles away. The carved bone that Anna had given him during their first encounter now served as a communication device, allowing him to coordinate with other protectors across the circumpolar north. "What would you have us do?" asked a young man whose tribe had lost their traditional fishing grounds to pollution from a uranium mine. Our legal challenges are ignored, our protests are silenced. Our attempts at direct action result in arrests and imprisonment. You fight on a battlefield of their choosing, Jack replied, understanding flooding through him as the spirits whispered guidance. They have superior weapons, more money, better lawyers, political connections that reach into the highest levels of government. But they have no defense against forces they don't believe exist. He stood and moved to the edge of the circle, feeling power building around him like the aurora borealis made manifest. The bare claw knife sang at his side, its ancient metal responding to energies that connected this moment to every other time in history, when the guardians of the sacred places had been called upon to defend their trust. The corporations see the Arctic as dead matter to be exploited, Jack continued, his words carrying overtones that spoke to the deepest levels of consciousness. They cannot conceive of a living landscape that fights back, of spirits that defend their territory as fiercely as any human army. Our strength lies not in matching their technology, but in awakening forces they have no power to control. Over the following days, Jack began teaching the assembled representatives techniques that went far beyond traditional survival skills. He showed them how to read the subtle signs that indicated spiritual activity, how to call upon the guardian spirits of their territories, how to create disturbances in the natural order that would make industrial operations impossible to sustain. The lessons were not without risk. Working with spiritual forces required perfect balance and absolute respect for the powers being invoked. A hunter who called upon the bear spirits for protection might find himself hunted by bears if his intentions were impure. A shaman who tried to command the wind might be swept away by the very forces she sought to control. But the need was desperate, and the representatives proved to be dedicated students. Many already possessed abilities that they had never fully developed, spiritual gifts that had been suppressed by decades of pressure to assimilate into the dominant culture. Under Jack's guidance, these dormant powers began to awaken. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. A convoy of heavy machinery approached the village just 3 weeks after the council meeting, accompanied by private security forces and legal documents that purported to grant mining rights to the entire territory. The vehicles were larger and more intimidating than the oil exploration equipment Jack had faced during his test with Torngay, and the men who accompanied them had the bearing of soldiers rather than workers. But the defenders who met them were no longer simply indigenous people armed with traditional weapons and moral arguments. They were spiritual warriors who had learned to work in harmony with forces that predated human civilization by millions of years. Jack stood at the front of the defensive line, no longer needing to face such challenges alone. Anna and Peter flanked him, their young faces serene with confidence in powers they had inherited from ancestors who had never doubted the reality of spiritual protection. Thomas and the other elders formed a second rank, their voices raised in chants that seemed to make the very air vibrate with energy. Behind them, representatives from a dozen different communities added their own traditions to the growing confluence of power. Throat singers from the eastern territories, drum circles from the central tundra, medicine women from the coastal regions, all contributing to a spiritual defense that turned the entire landscape into a living barrier against intrusion. The effect on the approaching convoy was immediate and dramatic. Equipment that had functioned perfectly during the journey across hundreds of miles of Arctic terrain began failing as soon as it crossed into the protected zone. Engines died despite full fuel tanks, electronic systems shorted out without explanation, and even simple mechanical devices refused to operate properly. More unsettling still were the psychological effects on the personnel. Hardened security contractors found themselves overwhelmed by feelings of dread and displacement, as if they were trespassing in a place that actively rejected their presence. Several men abandoned their positions and walked away from the convoy. Unable to explain their actions, but unwilling to remain in an area that felt increasingly hostile to their continued existence. The project manager, a different man from the one Jack had faced the year before, attempted to rally his forces with appeals to professionalism and contractual obligations. But his words fell on deaf ears as man after man succumbed to the growing certainty that they were in a place where they did not belong. Within 6 hours, the entire convoy had withdrawn, leaving behind only a few pieces of abandoned equipment that would gradually be reclaimed by the ice and snow. The victory was complete, but Jack knew it was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. News of the successful defense spread across the Arctic faster than any electronic communication could have carried it. Indigenous communities that had been facing similar threats began implementing the techniques Jack had taught, creating a network of spiritually protected territories that corporate interests found impossible to penetrate. The outside world's response was predictably confused and angry. Government officials demanded investigations into what they assumed must be sophisticated sabotage operations. Corporate executives hired teams of experts to analyze the equipment failures and develop countermeasures. Environmental groups hailed the developments as evidence of some kind of new activist technology. None of them suspected the truth, that the Arctic itself had awakened as a conscious entity determined to protect itself from exploitation. The spirits that had slumbered beneath the ice for generations were rising in response to threats that endangered not just individual communities, but the entire ecosystem that sustained life in the frozen north. Jack found himself at the center of this awakening, serving as both coordinator and spiritual anchor for a movement that transcended anything the world had seen before. The failed rancher from Texas had become something unprecedented, a human being who could speak for the earth itself, translating the needs and concerns of a living planet into terms that other humans could understand. The responsibilities were overwhelming, but they were also liberating. For the first time in his life, Jack felt completely aligned with his purpose. Every skill he had learned, every hardship he had endured, every failure he had survived had been preparation for this role. The shame and regret that had driven him from Texas seemed like ancient history, replaced by a sense of belonging that connected him to every living thing in the Arctic. As winter deepened into the long darkness that marked the heart of the Arctic year, Jack stood once again on the shore where his transformation had begun. The aurora borealis danced overhead in patterns that spoke of approval from the spirit realm, and the carved bone at his chest pulsed with warmth that connected him to protectors across the circumpolar north. Anna and Peter joined him, no longer the frightened children he had first rescued, but confident young adults who carried the future of their people in their capable hands. Thomas approached from the village, his weathered face reflecting satisfaction with the legacy he was leaving behind. "The ice is safe," the elder observed, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "For now and for the generations to come. The guardians have awakened, and they will not sleep again." Jack nodded, feeling the truth of those words in every fiber of his being. The Arctic had found its voice, and that voice spoke through him and through hundreds of others, who had learned to bridge the gap between the ancient world and the modern. 1. The sacred places would be protected, the balance would be maintained, and the children of the ice would inherit a world that honored both tradition and necessary change. The failed cowboy who had once lost everything he thought he valued had found something infinitely more precious, a purpose that would outlast his own lifetime, and a legacy that would protect the frozen heart of the world for all the generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.